And we're just going to have a Q&A here. So I will ask a question and I'll pose it to either Mark or Waikit to go ahead and respond. So when it comes to virtual meetings and getting together virtually, what would you say makes for an effective virtual meeting? Mark, let's go ahead and start with you.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, for me, the single word is practice. You know, this is all new technology. And there's new stuff coming on the market every day. Actually taking time as a team to practice reduces the stress. Some people are Zoom aces. Some people have come from another technology. So actually taking time to learn these new tools and be comfortable with them and encourage everyone to kind of adopt them, I think leads to when it really comes down to needing that synchronous conversation. Being able to have everyone be able to participate and not have it be stilted or stressed or, awkward. I think that's kind of, for me, that has done the most to make it a fun experience for everyone.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Waikit, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just two things to add to that. I think one is, goal setting, right? I think this is whether you're in person or remote these days. What is the goal for the meeting? What is a success criteria for the meeting? What do we need to achieve at the end? I feel like as we have more remote meetings these days, it's even harder to actually corral that and to put those structure in place in the beginning. The second thing I think is, and this is a new thing that all of us are dealing with over the past year with remote, right, is how do you capture artifacts? How do you capture outcomes and outputs out of the meeting in such a way that that you can refer back to, right? I find in talking to different folks over the past year, one of the big challenges everyone has is just, sort of basic record keeping, right? Who took the notes from 2 months ago? We need to take a look at it. Who had it? Was it you, Joe, or was it you, John? So I think being able to kind of set the baseline, it doesn't have to be complicated, just an overarching organizing principle, right? I think that's the theme that I always think about when it comes to remote work, right? You gotta have an organizing principle. It doesn't have to be complex. In fact, it shouldn't be complex. It should be simple, right? Where the output of the meeting, the notes and everything else, where do they go, who's responsible for what, and those aren't technology dependent, right? So technology isn't the silver bullet here. I think a lot of it is just really setting up simple processes and expectations.
Yeah, I love that. I think about rules and roles, right? You have your team rituals, make sure everyone knows what the rules are, just like you did, Megan, right? These are the rules. Camera on if you can, boom, boom, boom. Just make sure everyone knows what's expected, and then give everyone a job to do. Who's going to be managing a parking lot? Who's going to make sure we don't leave the meeting before everyone's really clear on accountability and who's going to do what? And that also keeps people on their toes in the meeting. They got to lean in if they got a job to do.
Exactly. They kind of have to pay attention if they know that they're expected to do something, right? I wanted to touch on something, Waikit, that you mentioned, and that's the importance of documentation. And we know here at Workplaceless that documentation is so important for so many reasons for remote teams, but especially those meeting outcomes like you mentioned. And so do you have any tips or best practices for ways that you do document those meetings and those decisions that are made?
Yeah, so the way we do it at our company, and we've been remote since day one in the last 3 years or so, and we have kind of looked at what the mistakes we've done, and we've iterated over time. And what has worked for us is just very simple. In the meeting, someone is responsible for typing notes. Sometimes we rotate, sometimes it's just generally me. And we use our own software, RemoteHQ, and in some ways we are the first customers of our own platform. So whatever notes that we take in our notes app within RemoteHQ, it just automatically gets saved to the call log, right? So that's, this is sort of the classical, we build the feature for ourselves. But beyond that, again, tools, I think people over rely on tools, right? The one thing I've learned just also from talking to, users of ours, customers of ours, as well as folks I know who have been remote even before COVID, right? The one thing, the expectation setting is really important. I think a lot of people, when they went from in-person to remote, when COVID hits, a lot of the assumptions were implicit, right? And the problem is that not everyone understands the big changes. So I think we have to, as management team or as team leads, we have to make explicit even basic assumptions that we think most people would understand. From a perspective of, okay, guys, when we capture notes, we always need to put an owner to whatever the to-do list, right? And because if you don't, then it's just going to dangle. So things like that are some examples that we find that may be implied, but you kind of, from the top down, you kind of have to set the ground rules again, the same team.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know here at Workplaceless, we have a weekly sales call, and there are other members of the organization that benefit from the outcomes of those meetings. Who do we need to build relationships with, those types of things, but they don't necessarily need to spend time within the meeting. And so one of the things that I'm responsible for is posting a quick video recap. And so I just give them the bullets that are most critical to what they need to proceed with their projects. They know when to look for it, they know where to look for it. So the information is always accessible to them without them having to actually physically be meeting with us together. So to that point, how do you make that decision as to who should and should not be invited to the meeting? Mark, let's go ahead and start with you.
So yeah, it's, there are a lot of different models, and as you know, Mural's scaling rapidly. So we're feeling some of the challenges of going from a relatively small 100-person company, everyone in the company, who to go to. You can be very fast and loose with your communication into now, 350 plus and growing. So like Waikit's mentioning, we need to actually kind of grow up, and we need to have some of these, we need to balance the super creative, in the moment, design thinky, freedom with velocity and actually getting things done. And then teams being able to understand what are the connective tissue between them. So I think projects need to be aware of the resources that are available. I think investments that you make in some team self-awareness, some team building, playing to each other's strengths, right? There are people that just love organizing stuff and scheduling stuff. And there are people that would rather, dig a ditch than be forced to do that type of stuff. So you need that awareness so that you have the right strength in the right seat. And then you need to look at, okay, so how do these teams need to communicate to each other? And then what are the tools we're going to use? Sharing best practices, being able to unlearn and relearn, right? Another team might have solved something, internally. One team adopted Loom. If you haven't heard of it, it's like a very short format video that you can share your screen, capture video. And we use that incessantly to take an idea or a thing and make it asynchronous. And has really preserved the value of the times when we get together. If everyone can watch that asynchronously in the morning, in the night, in Bangladesh, wherever they happen to be, everyone has that groundwork when they come in. And so, like you say, Megan, that's also a way for you to capture just the essentials, just the too long, didn't read, TLDR, right? This is just what you need so that you can stay in sync as these gears are trying to figure out how to mesh together.
Exactly. Thank you. Waikit, anything to add to that?
Yeah, one thing we've found, just to add on to what Mark said, you're not going to get it perfect the first time, even the 12th time, to be honest, right? It's an ongoing process of fine-tuning the process and the sort of the cadence that works for each team, and each team has it differently. So one thing I always recommend is do a retroactive, right? Do a very candid assessment every so often with the participants, with your team. Hey, how do you find that we are over meeting? What can we do to be better? And just kind of look back at what are some of the things that work well and some of the things that didn't work well in the ways that we've met. I think what Mark said is really important, and this framework of synchronous meetings are very expensive. They're a productivity drag, right? So a rule of thumb I always think of, and personally for our team, is minimize synchronous meetings, right? Do as much asynchronously as possible. That also makes sure that it doesn't take a person out of, their flow or them or being in the zone, right? So this is the productivity killer, right? You're in the zone, you've got a block of 2 hours of time, and suddenly someone schedules the 10, 15, half an hour meeting, and now you got a context switch, right? Context switching is super expensive. So, so we tend to minimize that.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, such great points. And so when you're making that determination between what should be handled asynchronously or whenever people have time within their day, and what needs to happen when we're all together synchronously in a meeting like this, how do you make that determination?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's hard. I think, again, for us, what we've found is, as we kind of got the cadence of decision making, who is, and some teams are really good at that, where they basically, everyone knows who the decision makers are, who the influences of that decision maker are. So those are the guys that need to talk, right? Whether they talk asynchronously preferred or synchronously, it doesn't matter, but ultimately you have the decider, and then you've got a small cadre of sort of guys, folks who have input into the decisions. So I think those are the folks who ought to touch each other synchronously or asynchronously. Everyone should just not be in the data path. I think the problem is that when you don't have that delineation and you run, this is so common. We see this all the time as we talk to folks who are sort of new to remote work, right? Which is, who should be in what meeting and who's responsible for what. Even harder because you can no longer walk down the hallway and tap someone on the shoulder and say, well, should I be in there, right? Again, this is where the explicit instructions and explicit structure comes into play.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to something Waikit mentioned right off the bat, which is getting clear on the intention, like why are you meeting? And I think we have very narrow definitions of why we meet. In a worst case scenario, you're meeting to talk about the work that needs to be done. That's the worst time waster of all. I think there are lots of reasons to get together. Sometimes, a team misses a ship date, right? A valid reason to get together is, as a facilitator or manager, is to play the coach, right? You got to do a pep talk. And that sometimes those things, especially in distributed teams, coming together is a way to reduce the loneliness or the individual challenges or guilt that people may be facing and come together as a team. And that synchronous energy sharing of everyone knowing we can get through this or we can learn from it is actually a great reason to come together. But we have these super narrow definitions. It's like, it's the retrospective. It's the stand-up, and calendars are, a friend of mine from Lucid Team says calendars are weaponized meeting technology. I can shoot an hour hole in your calendar without having an agenda, a reason, and I can do it to a lot of people at once without ever stopping to think, what is the reason why we're coming together? And should we?
Yeah, that's such a great point. It's actually coming up in chat right now about the importance of an agenda, and some people setting boundaries saying, listen, if you don't include an agenda and an objective in the meeting invitation, I'm going to deny the meeting invitation. I'm not even going to show up. So it's such a great point. Okay, and then this might be the last question before we go ahead and move into participant Q&A. But when you are gathered together, how are you ensuring engagement when people are lagging? Maybe it's right after lunch or maybe it's late in the afternoon. How do you go ahead and get them participating?
Go ahead, Mike.
That's a good question. That's a common occurrence. I think whoever the host or the meeting organizer, it's incumbent upon him or her to just really monitor and understand the body language of the room and see if there's certain folks who are just who are too passive when they should be a bit more active. you know, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that's kind of what we've done. The other thing we've done here, just to make sure that people participate, a lot of times we, you know, whatever the agenda of the meeting is, we try to set the expectations as much as we can to push the you know, what I call the homework to the edges, right? To each person, right? So here's an example. I might not be clear enough. Some teams are great at brainstorming meetings, but some teams aren't, right? Personally, I find brainstorming meetings to be not great if you don't come prepared and with a point of view, or with some point of view. So the worst sort of meetings I've seen is, okay, let's do a brainstorming meeting. People come in, they haven't really done the prepping. They haven't really independently thought about what their, you know, what their point of view is. And so they stay quiet, right? So they're passive. And then when they're called upon, the problem doesn't go away, right? Because they haven't really thought about it. They don't really have an opinion. So some of this are sort of symptomatic, in my experience, of the, you know, if certain decisions need to be made, or certain decisions need to be synthesized, like people need to basically just chew through certain materials, understand it, have a point of view, or at least have some form of, you know, an answer, and then come and we can discuss and we can debate. And at the end of the hour or half an hour, we need to decide on a course of action, you know, and that's it. Yeah.
I would say for me, I think I come from a design background, and facilitation is a skill that I've developed. Some people have a naturally high, you know, emotional IQ or empathy, that kind of thing. You can build on that, but I think it's a skill. I think it's a quintessential 21st century skill. We all need to know actually how to facilitate meetings. You're already using some great best practices here in this call. Right away, invite people to say hi in the Slack channel. Or the chat channel, right? So we've got this multipathing going on where people are sharing links and notions, and that conversation actually supports what's happening here. From a facilitator standpoint, you do the rules and roles, give everyone something to do, that keeps them engaged. Using the attendee list, and just every so often calling out and saying, so Megan, you've been kind of quiet. Do you have anything about that? And no harm, no foul. We have a great thing we do called I was in Hawaii, right? Not everyone is not going to be 100% engaged 100% of the time. And I may ask you a question, or someone may ask me a question, and they get the deer in the headlights. Like, I'm sorry, I was thinking about the groceries I forgot to get last night or something, right? So you just say, I'm sorry, I was in Hawaii. And then you can invite the person. Don't worry, I was asking this, you worked on that project. I thought you might have something to add there. And you just draw them right back in, lower the stress, keep the conversation going. But also intentional heads down, like desk time versus wall time is another metaphor. Our friends at Voltage Control introduced that concept to me, and it's so practical. In a workshop, there are times where you're individually generative, right? Giving people that time to be thoughtful and get some things down. And then when it comes to the group discussion, everyone's got a couple things in hand, you know, that they can contribute. But also to Waikit's point, if you're just diverging, just brainstorming that just diverges forever is useless. At a certain point, a facilitator needs to kind of curve that in and say, okay, so now let's narrow the focus. Let's pull the top 5 things here that we should discuss further, that warrant further discussion. And it's that shaping the conversation over and over and over again that I think really falls to a facilitation role. And I think it's something that when you're in a meeting that's well facilitated, you're like, this was amazing. And when it's not there, you struggle, and someone tries to step in to do it, and maybe they're qualified, maybe they aren't. But I think it's a skill that we encourage, and there's lots of great resources out there. Anyone that has an inclination to kind of add that to their CV, I think would do themselves a tremendous service.
Really great tips. I especially love the I was in Hawaii rule, you know, creating that space for someone to feel safe enough to say, oh, sorry, I missed that, without having to feel embarrassed or ashamed that they were not 100% engaged, is definitely something that you need to set at the culture level within your organization, because I know That doesn't fly everywhere, but definitely something to consider, especially when working within your smaller teams.
Otherwise, they'll try and answer a question guessing at what you asked them and waste everyone's time for 5 minutes and look more stupid than they did originally. So it's not a winning play.
Exactly. I know some other things that we do is intentionally including like stretch breaks or time to get, water, or here at Workplaceless, we're big fans of dance parties. So whether you want to keep your camera on and be silly with the team or turn it off, just a quick 1 or 2 minute get up and, get your wiggles out and get refreshed again. That's always helpful, especially for those longer meetings that surpass that, 1.5 to 2 hour mark. Perfect. Anything else to add to that?
Yeah, say an hour, you can push an hour without a bio break, but 90 minutes, you got to give people a break in there. And especially if you're distributed globally, some people are up, it's in the middle of the night. Some people are up really early in the morning. So mindful of where everyone in the team is at.
Exactly. Yeah, it makes such a difference. Someone who's just starting their day is in a completely different mindset than someone who's trying to wrap this up so that they can get to their dinner, with their family. So making sure that you're aware of where everyone is located and what kind of mindset they might be in is helpful from the facilitator's perspective to make sure that, number one, you're not going over time or anything like that, but also just understanding that there will be differences in terms of engagement. Awesome. Okay, well, that is the last of the prepared questions. We do have some questions Katie's been adding to the mural, so I'm going to go ahead and actually share my screen again. Okay, perfect. So first question here we have, is there any feedback on whether capturing documentation is better with Wikilike Shared Documentation System versus a simple shared drive like Google Drive? So this is a tools related question.
Yeah, I can chime in. I tend to favor simplicity. So, we are a Google shop. So a lot of documentation are in shared drives on Google, and that has worked pretty well. We know of other companies who use Wikilike shared documentation systems that are, there are a bunch of tools out there. They use those and they have been happy with it. I think there's no right or wrong answer. I think, thematically, keep starting simple is the easiest. Especially think about starting simple and think about making sure the tool has the right sharing permissions and the like, and the right security too. I think those are kind of my criteria and our criteria when we kind of look at, what sort of tooling we need for our team.
Yeah, I would agree. I always favor starting simple. We're in the middle of all these discussions right now. One of the advantages that we're starting to see is adopting wiki-style tools does allow one team to come up with a really good format for, a share back or an initiative declaration or a PRD or whatever you want to call it. And so that does become a really nice way to provide a template for other teams to have kind of a skeleton, some architecture, so that all the teams know what to expect in the order. Because if everyone kind of adopts their own format, there's a cognitive load in trying to parse the way someone else is going about it. But I always favor like crawl before you run. So make sure that you're understanding, get clear on what the initiative is and all the team members and the right resourcing and all that stuff. And then when it needs to scale, there's this point at which you definitely need resources. You need someone to be managing the maintenance of that wiki resource. Whereas small teams can work super efficiently if it's just a couple of docs on a shared drive. So it's, I would agree. You start small, but when it's time to scale, don't be afraid to actually adopt some new processes that help you work ultimately more efficiently, even though there's a learning curve that may seem like it's slowing you down for a bit.
Great, thank you both for that. Next, we have one rule that this person has encountered is that the meeting notes must be sent out within 1 hour from the end of the meeting. Do you think that this is a useful use of rules or documentation? I know what we do is part of our meeting agenda is we have in our project management system tasks to go ahead and create your action items in our project management system, send out any recaps that need to be sent out. And those are usually due, by the end of that day. Any feedback there regarding that time frame?
For me, I'd just be asking who needs these notes urgently and why do they need them? And if it's the case of, there's some companies that have almost like a 24-hour production cycle, right? So it is critical for East Coast to get those notes up because West Coast is waking up and they're going to rely on them to have something prepared for Asia Pacific and then Tel Aviv. And, so if there is a legitimate driving factor, for me, it sounds like it's a good practice because if I don't do something within that hour, I'm going to forget a lot. I'm going to forget the critical context and the notes actually lose value or they don't get done at all. So my question would be like, what is the problem you're trying to solve by doing them within the hour? And if so, that's great.
Yeah, I don't have anything on that. I think Mark is right on that. I'll say the same, yeah.
And I was just going to add, not to commercialize Mural too much, but we love Mural for this purpose because you can see it's very easy to add decisions to the Mural itself. And then there is no note taking, right? It's all happened throughout the meeting. And so there's no additional task that needs to be done to go ahead and share this information with anybody else. It's very clearly laid out and you can see what was the question, what was discussed, and then what was the end result, what needs to happen next. And then just one more question before we go ahead and switch up into breakout rooms. Any thoughts or tips to transition when you do have those days where you're back to back to back meetings, constantly switching modes and gears? Any words of advice for someone like that?
Yeah, I totally identify with. On days where I have a lot of back-to-back meetings, what I do is I try not to do it unless those meetings with the only time the counterparties can do it. I usually try to have at least like 15 minutes or 30 minutes in between, so I can actually get some work done in between and just kind of context switch a little bit. Yeah, my personal rule is I try not to have, more than 3 meetings, like synchronous meetings a day, because I think 3 or more meetings a day, like my mind just turns into mush and I'm not feeling productive and getting stuff done. So
yeah, I would agree. I think in the meetings that I manage and I can control, if it's booked for an hour, I do what I can to try and end it at 45 to 50 because I know that may be the only moment that people have to go get a cup of coffee or do a bio break or so, so but they're on those days where you just book back to back to back. I think part of it is it's a good time to take an assessment about, do I need to be in all of these, and actually start some asynchronous conversations about, I'm at my limit. Sometimes people aren't aware. They're just booking and trying to do the right thing and keep people informed. And at some point you need to have your own boundaries and understand when you're completely non-productive and just let people know that's not working for me. And in most cases, people go, oh, I didn't know. Yeah, that's fine. We can shorten it, or let's do it on Tuesdays as opposed to Thursdays. I don't care. It's that lack of communication or, the culture that makes it feel like, well, I gotta, as opposed to I'm a human and this might not work for me. And it's okay to speak up. I think that gets to some culture questions as well.
Such a great point. I think a lot of times people are afraid to bring that up. They don't want to hurt someone's feelings, or they recognize that, this time works for everybody else. So maybe I need to just tough it out and let it sink in. But always bringing that up to, whoever the facilitator is, or maybe your manager, just letting them know where you are, because to Mark's point, they probably don't know. They just saw an open spot on the calendar and took it. So great advice.